The USS Resolve drifted silently in the shadow of the neutral zone, its hull gleaming in the dim light of distant stars. Captain Jason Kane stood at the helm, his fingers lightly tracing the surface of a navigation console, his thoughts distant. His mind was already on the approaching diplomatic summit, the one that would, in theory, settle the escalating tension between the Galactic Empire and the Terran Coalition. But in the depths of his gut, a gnawing feeling told him that peace was an illusion. A crackling voice over the comms pulled him from his reverie. Captain General Dillard's transport has entered the zone. The Council is ready for the meeting, came the calm voice of Lieutenant Commander Eric Westfield. A veteran of both systems engineering and artificial intelligence, Westfield's sharp wit was often a contrast to his relaxed demeanor. Kane exhaled sharply. "Understood, Lieutenant Commander. Prepare the ship for the briefing, and get Major Grayson on the line." As he made his way toward the briefing room, his thoughts lingered on the mission that had brought them to this point, an alliance formed under duress. A coalition of systems with humanity caught between an empire that sought to crush them and a galaxy that was rapidly losing faith in their place in it. Inside the briefing room, Major Alex Grayson, tall and stern with the discipline of a career Marine, was already seated. Grayson's close friendship with General Marcus Dillard, a man of unwavering conviction, was known to everyone aboard the Resolve. Grayson had always been more than just a military officer. He was the soul of the crew's resolve, a reminder of why they fought. "How are we feeling, Major?" Kane asked, settling into his chair. Grayson only nodded grimly, his voice low. "If it's going to be anything like the last time, it's not going to end well." Captain Kane nodded, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Let's just hope Dillard can work his usual magic." But as the minutes ticked by, the expected transmission from the Council was delayed. Kane's instincts began to stir with unease. Just as he opened his mouth to ask for an update, the holoscreen flickered to life. It was a message from the Galactic Empire. Kane's heart sank as he saw the crisp, cold face of the Imperial officer, Commodore Varon, who had engineered the peace talks. A message that should have been one of diplomacy instead became a sentence of death. The screen showed General Dillard, flanked by guards, standing on a stark, barren surface, his hands bound, but his head held high. Kane's blood ran cold as Varon's voice, devoid of emotion, echoed in the room. "In light of the Terran Coalition's refusal to surrender, we have decided to make an example. General Dillard will not return to you." Before anyone could react, the broadcast cut to a close-up of Dillard, defiant in the face of his execution. The cold crack of a blaster rang out, and the general's body crumpled, a final act of humiliation and control from the Empire. The feed cut to black. For a long moment no one spoke. Grayson's jaw clenched so tight that the muscle along his temple twitched. Lieutenant Commander Westfield, usually the calmest among them, was the first to break the silence, his voice brittle. "They killed him," he muttered. "They killed him. Right in front of us." Kane's eyes burned with fury, but it was the silence of his crew that spoke volumes. Major Grayson's fists clenched into tight balls, and Ensign Rivera, the youngest among them, looked as if the world had collapsed beneath him. "Give me the Council," Kane said, his voice cold as steel. Minutes later, the Terran Coalition Council appeared on the holoscreen. The stern faces of Earth's top officials filled the room, each one more distant than the last. The screen flickered to life with the face of Admiral Helena Avery, a woman Kane knew to be as calculating as she was ruthless. "Captain Kane," she began, her voice clipped. "What is the status of General Dillard?" Kane stared back at the Council, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, rage, sorrow, disbelief. But beneath it all was something else, a spark of something dark and inevitable. "He's dead." Kane's voice cut through the room. "The Empire made an example of him. We need to act now." Admiral Avery's eyes narrowed, the weight of the situation settling in. "We've seen the transmission. The Empire's message is clear. This cannot go unpunished." "It won't," Kane replied, his eyes steely. We'll need to hit them where it hurts. The resolve can lead the charge. The council members exchanged silent glances, a heavy silence settling over them. Finally, Admiral Avery spoke, her decision firm and resolute. We cannot let this act of aggression slide. The Galactic Empire's cruelty has gone too far. Captain Kane, you have our permission to initiate a retaliatory strike. But be advised, the Empire will not let this pass lightly. They will target civilian systems, and their retribution will be swift. We know what we're up against, Kane replied, his voice unwavering. The first step is simple. We hit them fast. We'll need to retrieve the Imperial data on their new warship technology. I believe we have a location for a remote outpost. A tense silence lingered as the council deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Admiral Avery's voice broke through a final, dangerous ultimatum. Do it. But remember, Captain, failure is not an option. Humanity's future hinges on your success. With the transmission severed, the crew of the Resolve moved with military precision. Westfield and Rivera began scanning the available data, locating the outpost, while Grayson and his Marines prepared for a high-risk mission. As the Resolve hurtled toward the outpost, Kane stood at the command deck, his mind focused on the operation ahead. The Empire had just made the first move, and now it was their turn to strike back. In the dead of space, there was no room for mercy. Only retribution. Only war. The team boarded shuttles, slipping through the void toward the outpost as though their very lives depended on it. Because they did. And the stakes had never been higher. The future of humanity lay in the balance. And this first strike would set the tone for the war to come. They succeeded, but it came at a cost. The technology they recovered revealed a critical vulnerability. The Empire's warships were controlled by a single, centralized command network. Disrupting it would cripple their fleet. Kane clenched his fists, knowing that the real battle had only just begun. The Resolve had set the stage for humanity's fight for survival and for justice. 6 months into the war, the USS Resolve had become both a symbol of humanity's resolve and a testament to its resilience. The ship, once a flag-bearer of diplomacy and peace, was now the center of innovation, its corridors lined with the grim faces of soldiers, engineers, and scientists alike, all working relentlessly against an empire that had outclassed them at every turn. Humanity had suffered, yes, but it had begun to adapt. Captain Jason Kane stood at the command deck, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes scanning the stars. The weight of leadership had become heavier with each passing day, the losses mounting in both human lives and the slow erosion of morale among his crew. The Resolve was not just a ship, it had become a crucible, a place where humanity's best minds and most daring warriors were forced to come together to turn the tide. Captain, the prototype is ready for testing, came the voice of Lieutenant Commander Eric Westfield, his ever-calm presence an anchor in the storm of chaos. Westfield had become indispensable in recent months, assisting Dr. Brian Carver in reverse engineering the Imperial technology that had once seemed insurmountable. Kane turned from the viewport, his eyes meeting Westfield's. Good. Get Dr. Carver on the comms. Let's make sure this works before we put it into play. Dr. Carver appeared on the holoscreen a few moments later, his face gaunt from long hours spent in the lab. His work had become crucial to their survival, the reverse engineering of the Empire's technology, forming the backbone of their counteroffensive. The EMP weapons they had developed could disable the Empire's centralized command network, which had been their primary advantage. The prospect of finally turning the tide in humanity's favor felt tantalizingly close. We've adapted the device to work on a much larger scale, Carver said, his voice steady despite the evident exhaustion. This EMP will cut through their command channels and leave their fleets blind. It's a gamble, but it's the only chance we have. Kane nodded, his mind already focused on the next move. Then it's time to see if it works. Major Grayson, you're up. I need you to lead a strike team into an Imperial shipyard. We need to test this weapon under real conditions. Grayson, who had become colder and more calculating in the wake of General Dillard's death, met Kane's gaze with a silent nod. His transformation over the past months had been marked by an insatiable thirst for vengeance. The loss of his comrades had hardened him, and the idea of hitting the Empire where it hurt was now his singular focus. "We're ready," Grayson said, his voice low, the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. The strike team moved quickly, and within hours, they were aboard the Resolve shuttle, racing toward the heart of the Empire's shipyard. The mission was a high-risk endeavor, but failure was not an option. The fate of humanity's war effort rested on the success of the EMP weapon. As the team infiltrated the shipyard, Grayson's senses were on high alert. Everything had been meticulously planned, but as with all things in war, uncertainty loomed. Westfield's voice crackled through his comms, guiding the team as they approached the control center of the shipyard. "Steady," Grayson murmured to his team. "We're almost there." But as they neared their target, things began to unravel. A sudden burst of gunfire cut through the silence. One of the strike team members, a trusted officer, turned on them, weapons blazing. Grayson's heart skipped a beat. It was a betrayal. An Imperial officer they had captured earlier had betrayed them. The confusion and chaos that followed were like a whirlwind, as Grayson's team was torn apart in the ensuing firefight. By the time the dust settled, half of his men were dead or critically wounded. Grayson stood among the wreckage, seething with rage and disbelief. The mission was a success. Imperial command systems had been crippled by the EMP. But the cost was steep. He had lost good men, and the betrayal would haunt him. Back aboard the Resolve, Captain Kane's face hardened as the report came in. He was no stranger to loss, but the sight of Grayson's team returning with so few members struck at something deeper, an understanding that their fight had only just begun, and the road ahead would be paved with sacrifice. "Grayson report," Kane said, his voice even, though the weight of the situation hung between them. "The weapon worked, sir," Grayson replied, his voice grating with exhaustion. "But we were compromised. A traitor on the inside led to half of my men being killed." Kane nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We'll deal with that later. The important thing is that we now have a way to cripple their fleets. This is the breakthrough we needed." Yet, even as victory tasted sweet, a deeper unease gnawed at Kane. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that the Empire wasn't just fighting to win. They were fighting to annihilate. Back in the Resolve's war room, Dr. Carver was analyzing the data from the mission, his face pale. "Captain, there's something you need to see." Kane moved to his side, his stomach sinking as the scientist's report scrolled across the screen. The Empire, it seemed, had been preparing for something far worse than anyone had imagined. "They're building a planet killer," Carver said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kane's blood ran cold. The Empire was not merely fighting to win. They were preparing to make an example of Earth itself. "The weapon is already operational," Carver continued, "and it's targeted at Earth." The implications hit with the force of a physical blow. Humanity's survival, its very future, now hung in the balance. They had barely begun to adapt, barely started to strike back, and now they were facing their greatest threat yet. Kane turned to his crew, his mind already calculating the impossible. "Prepare for a full assault. We need to stop that weapon before it's too late." As the crew scrambled to prepare, Major Grayson's cold gaze met Kane's. The war was far from over, and the stakes had just been raised to unimaginable heights. The fight for humanity's survival had taken on a new, terrifying urgency. The Resolve cut through the cold expanse of Imperial space like a blade through silk. Its hull was scarred, its systems patched together by countless hours of ingenuity and desperation, but it was alive, and it was the symbol of humanity's tenacity. Captain Kane stood at the command deck, staring out into the vast nothingness ahead. The final mission was upon them. The fleet they commanded, Terran and Allied ships, a patchwork of desperation and hope, was ready. The Empire, once untouchable, now felt the sting of humanity's resilience. "Captain," came the voice of Lieutenant Commander Westfield, his hands dancing over the ship's controls as the AI drones deployed around the fleet. "The grid is offline. We've got a window." It's now or never. Kane didn't need to hear more. He knew the stakes. The plan was simple. Disable the Empire's planetary defenses long enough for the fleet to breach the Imperial homeworld's atmosphere. Westfield had used their reverse-engineered Imperial technology to deploy a network of AI-driven drones, wreaking havoc on the Empire's automated defense systems. For the first time in the war, the Empire's superiority seemed momentarily irrelevant. "Let's move," Kane ordered, his voice steady as the fleet surged forward. Meanwhile, on the ground, Major Grayson's team had already infiltrated the Empire's outer defenses. The mission was a suicide run. Destroy the control center of the planet-killer weapon before it could be activated. The air was thick with tension as Grayson, battle-hardened and unflinching, led his men toward their target. They fought their way through the complex with a relentless determination, each step forward costing them dearly. Grayson had no illusions about the cost of this mission. His men were dying in the halls of this Imperial fortress, but each death brought them closer to victory. He knew the stakes. He had seen what the Empire was capable of, and if this weapon was allowed to fire, all hope would be lost. As they reached the control center, the unmistakable hum of the planet-killer weapon's power, surging into readiness, rang in their ears. The countdown had begun. Grayson turned to his second-in-command, a seasoned officer who had been by his side since the beginning. "Get to the control room. Disable the launch sequence," he barked. "I won't make it back, will I, sir?" the officer asked, understanding in his eyes. Grayson's answer was grim. "No, you won't." As the officer ran ahead, Grayson's voice carried over the comms. "Captain, we're in position. This is it." "I'm counting on you, Major," Kane's voice replied, tight with worry. But the sacrifice was inevitable. Grayson stayed behind, ensuring the weapon's destruction even as the enemy closed in around him. The explosion that tore through the control center was the last thing Grayson saw. His sacrifice saved humanity, but it cost him everything. Back in the Resolve S command deck, Kane received the grim news. His heart weighed heavy with loss. But the mission was a success. Grayson's death, while a brutal blow, had ensured that Earth's destruction would not come at the hands of the Empire. The final showdown was about to unfold. The fleet now pressed toward the heart of Imperial space, the Resolve at the lead. Captain Kane's mind was a blur of calculations, his strategy honed by years of warfare. The battle ahead would be their last chance. The Empire's flagship, the Vengeance, stood in their path, its massive silhouette dwarfing the Terran ships that surged toward it. Kane's mind raced as he mapped out the sequence of moves, the risks that would determine the outcome. "Prepare for battle," Kane said, his voice unyielding. "We strike now." As the fleet closed in, the battle began in earnest. The Resolve unleashed everything in its arsenal, each shot calculated with precision. But it was the final act that would decide their fate. Ensign Matthew Rivera, still raw from the horrors of the war, but hardened by it, made a decision that would define him. "We've got one shot at this," he said, his voice calm as he sat at the helm of a fighter. "I'm taking it." Rivera executed a daring maneuver, weaving through the storm of enemy fire with an agility that was almost impossible. The Vengeance loomed ahead, its massive superstructure glowing with power. Rivera's fighter shot through the chaos, threading the needle between bursts of plasma and laser fire. He engaged the final weapon, the explosive charge that would cripple the Empire's flagship once and for all. In the final seconds, as the world around him exploded in a kaleidoscope of light and fire, Rivera detonated the charge. The Vengeance erupted, its core cracking open like a dying star. The Empire's might was reduced to wreckage. The battle was over. The fleet had won. In the aftermath, as the smoke of the battle faded, Captain Kane stood on the bridge, his face an unreadable mask. The Vengeance was gone, and with it, the last of the Empire's fleet. The war was over. The Emperor's surrender was inevitable. Humanity had triumphed. As the victorious fleet returned to the Galactic Council, the surviving crew of the Resolve stood side by side. Grayson's sacrifice, Rivera's bravery, and every ounce of blood, sweat, and tears that had gone into the war were not forgotten. The price of victory had been steep, but the legacy of the fallen would live on. Standing before the council, Kane delivered the final speech that would reshape humanity's future. "We are no longer subjects," he declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "We are not your pawns. We are humanity, and we stand as equals among you. We have fought for our place in this galaxy, and we will fight to protect it." The council was silent, its members taken aback by the intensity of Kane's declaration. But in that moment the galaxy knew. Humanity had arrived. Victory had come at an unimaginable cost. Grayson, Rivera, and so many others had given their lives for it. And though the war was won, the scars would remain. Dr. Carver, standing beside Kane, knew the hard work was only just beginning. The peace that followed would require not only diplomacy, but healing, an understanding of the fragility of life, and the heavy burden of victory. As the crew of the Resolve looked toward the uncertain future, they did so with one shared vow: to honor the fallen and ensure their sacrifices were never forgotten. The war had ended, but humanity's journey had only just begun.